Welcome, dear listener, to the extraordinary story of Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, a man whose voice became the sound of defiance in humanity's darkest hour, whose words rallied a nation when all seemed lost, and whose indomitable spirit embodied the very best of human courage and determination. Tonight, we journey through the remarkable life of Britain's greatest wartime leader, a man who lived through the transformation of the modern world and who helped shape the course of the 20th century through sheer force of will and unwavering belief in the triumph of freedom over tyranny. As you settle into your comfortable position, allow your breathing to slow and deepen, like the gentle rhythm of waves against the white cliffs of Dover, those ancient guardians that have watched over Britain for millennia. Feel the tensions of the modern world fade away, replaced by the timeless spirit of a nation that has faced countless storms and emerged stronger with each trial. Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing in the gardens of Chartwell, Churchill's beloved country home, where the scent of roses mingles with the sound of his voice dictating memoirs that would win him the Nobel Prize for Literature. We will follow Churchill's journey from his birth in the magnificent Blenheim Palace to his final years as the elder statesman of the Western world. A life that spanned nearly a century and witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth of the modern age, and the greatest conflict in human history. We will witness his transformation from a young cavalry officer seeking glory on the frontiers of empire to the prime minister who stood alone against Nazi Germany when the fate of civilization hung in the balance. Let your mind drift like morning mist across the English countryside, past ancient castles and village churches, past the playing fields of Harrow where Churchill learned the lessons of leadership, past the chambers of Parliament where his voice would echo through the corridors of power for more than half a century. We will explore the paradoxes of this remarkable man, the aristocrat who championed the common people, the conservative who embraced radical social reforms, the warrior who yearned for peace, the man who suffered from depression yet inspired millions with his optimism and courage. Tonight, we will discover why Churchill's life story reads like an adventure novel, filled with daring escapes, political triumphs and disasters, literary achievements, and moments of supreme moral courage that defined not only his own character, but the character of his nation. We will examine how his early failures prepared him for his greatest success, how his understanding of history informed his vision of the future, and how his mastery of the English language became a weapon more powerful than any army. This is the story of a man who believed that destiny had chosen him for greatness, and who proved that belief correct when the world needed him most. As we journey through Churchill's remarkable life, let the story wash over you like the Thames flowing past the Houses of Parliament, carrying you peacefully toward the shores of sleep, while enriching your understanding of leadership, courage, and the power of words to change the world. Chapter 1: Born to Greatness, 1874 to 1895. Our story begins on November 30th, 1874, in the magnificent Blenheim Palace, one of England's grandest stately homes. where Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born into a world of privilege, tradition, and expectation. The palace itself was a monument to military glory, built to honor the first Duke of Marlborough's victory over the French at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704, and it seemed fitting that the future wartime leader should enter the world in a place dedicated to the memory of British triumph over continental tyranny. Picture, if you will, the splendor of Blenheim Palace on that late autumn day when Churchill was born. A Baroque masterpiece of golden stone rising from manicured parklands, its towers and domes reflecting the pale English sunlight, its vast halls filled with portraits of ancestors who had served crown and country for generations. The palace was more than a home. It was a symbol of the aristocratic tradition that had shaped British history for centuries. And young Winston would grow up surrounded by reminders of duty, honor, and service to the realm. Churchill's father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a brilliant but erratic politician who had risen rapidly in Conservative Party ranks before his career was cut short by illness and his own impetuous nature. Lord Randolph possessed the Churchill gift for oratory and the family's characteristic combination of courage and recklessness, traits that he would pass on to his eldest son, along with a complex legacy of achievement and unfulfilled promise. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American beauty whose father had made a fortune on Wall Street, bringing to the Churchill family not only wealth, but also the energy and optimism of the new world. The marriage between Lord Randolph and Jenny was emblematic of the Anglo-American alliance that would later become central to Winston's political philosophy. Jenny was intelligent, vivacious, and socially ambitious, moving easily in the highest circles of London society while maintaining her American independence of spirit. Her influence on young Winston was profound, instilling in him a love of America and Americans that would shape his understanding of international relations throughout his life. Winston's childhood was marked by the benign neglect that was typical of aristocratic families of the Victorian era. His parents were often absent, pursuing their political and social ambitions, leaving Winston and his younger brother Jack in the care of their beloved nanny, Mrs. Elizabeth Everest. Womb, as Winston called her, became the most important figure in his early life, providing the love, stability, and moral guidance that his parents' busy lives could not supply. Her influence on Churchill's character was immeasurable, teaching him compassion for ordinary people and instilling in him the values of loyalty, duty, and kindness that would temper his aristocratic pride throughout his life. Picture young Winston in the nursery at Blenheim, a red-haired, freckled boy with piercing blue eyes and an insatiable curiosity about the world around him. He was not an easy child. He was willful, demanding, and prone to spectacular tantrums when he did not get his way. But he also displayed early signs of the intelligence and determination that would mark his adult career. He loved toy soldiers and would spend hours arranging elaborate battles, developing the strategic thinking and attention to detail that would later serve him well as a military leader and war correspondent. Churchill's formal education began at St. George's School in Ascot, where he encountered the harsh discipline and rigid conformity of the Victorian educational system. The school was typical of its time, emphasizing classical languages, rote memorization, and physical punishment as the means of molding young gentlemen. Winston struggled with Latin and Greek, subjects that seemed irrelevant to his active mind, but he excelled in English and history, subjects that fired his imagination and connected with his growing sense of destiny. The young Churchill's relationship with authority was complex and often contentious. He respected genuine leadership and moral courage, but he chafed against arbitrary rules and meaningless restrictions. His teachers found him brilliant but difficult, capable of inspired work when interested but rebellious when bored. This pattern would persist throughout his life, as he consistently challenged conventional wisdom while demonstrating extraordinary ability when faced with genuine challenges. His transfer to Harrow School in 1888 marked a turning point in Churchill's development, as the more liberal atmosphere of this famous institution allowed his talents to flourish. Harrow had educated many of Britain's greatest leaders, and its traditions emphasized not just academic achievement, but also character development and public service. Winston thrived in this environment, excelling in English and history while developing his skills as a debater and public speaker. At Harrow, Churchill first encountered the works of Edward Gibbon, whose Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire would become one of his favorite books and a major influence on his understanding of history and politics. Gibbon's majestic prose style and his analysis of how great civilizations rise and fall resonated deeply with the young Churchill, who was already beginning to see himself as a potential guardian of British civilization against the forces of decline and decay. Picture Churchill in the Harrow Library during his final years at school, surrounded by the great works of English literature and history, his mind absorbing the lessons of the past while his imagination soared toward the future. He was 17 years old, a young man who had already decided that he was destined for greatness, but who had not yet discovered the form that greatness would take. His academic record was mixed, brilliant in subjects that interested him, mediocre in those that did not. But his teachers recognized that they were dealing with an exceptional mind that would not be constrained by conventional expectations. Churchill's decision to pursue a military career was influenced by both practical considerations and romantic idealism. His father believed that Winston lacked the intellectual discipline for law or politics, and the army offered a respectable career for a younger son of the aristocracy. But Winston was also drawn to the military by his love of adventure and his desire to test himself in the crucible of combat. The late Victorian era was the golden age of the British Empire, and young officers could expect to see action on the frontiers of empire, where they could win glory and advancement through courage and skill. His years at the Royal Military College at Sandhurst were among the happiest of Churchill's youth, as he finally found an educational environment that matched his interests and abilities. The curriculum emphasized practical subjects like military engineering, tactics, and leadership, while the physical training and outdoor exercises appealed to his active nature. He graduated 8th in his class of 150, a respectable showing that reflected both his natural abilities and his newfound motivation. The death of his father in January 1895, when Winston was just 20 years old, marked the end of his youth and the beginning of his adult career. Lord Randolph's death was a devastating blow to Winston, who had always hoped to win his father's approval and respect. But it also freed him from the shadow of paternal expectations and allowed him to chart his own course toward the destiny he felt awaiting him. As you continue to relax and drift towards sleep, picture the young Churchill on the day of his commissioning as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, standing proudly in his scarlet uniform as he prepares to embark on the adventures that will shape his character and prepare him for the great challenges that lie ahead. He is 20 years old, the product of the finest education that money and privilege can provide. But he is also a young man hungry for experience, eager to test himself against the world and determined to make his mark on history. The boy who played with toy soldiers in the nursery at Blenheim is about to become a real soldier, ready to seek his fortune on the frontiers of empire and to begin the journey that will make him one of the greatest leaders in British history. Chapter 2: Soldier and Correspondent, 1895 to 1900. The young Winston Churchill, who joined the 4th Queen's Own Hussars in February 1895, was a man in a hurry, eager to experience everything that life had to offer and impatient with the peacetime routine of a cavalry regiment stationed in England. The British Army of the 1890s was a professional force that maintained the peace of the largest empire in human history. But for ambitious young officers like Churchill, the real opportunities for advancement and glory lay on the distant frontiers where the empire was still expanding and where conflicts with native peoples provided the chance for active service and rapid promotion. Picture Churchill in his quarters at Aldershot, the great military camp where his regiment was stationed, as he pored over maps of the world and read accounts of recent campaigns in India, Africa, and other corners of the empire. He was a striking figure in his hussar uniform, with its elaborate braiding and plumed helmet. But beneath the military finery was a restless intelligence that craved action and adventure. The routine of peacetime soldiering, drill, inspection, and garrison duty held little appeal for a young man who had already decided that he was destined for greatness. Churchill's first taste of combat came not through official military channels, but through his own initiative and connections. In the autumn of 1895, he used his family's political influence to arrange a posting as an observer, with Spanish forces fighting Cuban rebels, a conflict that would later draw in the United States and mark the beginning of America's emergence as a global power. For Churchill, the Cuban expedition was an opportunity to experience warfare firsthand and to begin the career as a war correspondent that would make him famous throughout the English-speaking world. The journey to Cuba was Churchill's first venture outside Europe, and it opened his eyes to the wider world beyond the comfortable confines of English society. The voyage across the Atlantic, the exotic sights and sounds of Havana, and the tropical landscape of the Cuban countryside all made deep impressions on the young officer, who possessed an almost photographic memory for detail and a natural gift for vivid description. These experiences would later find their way into his dispatches for the Daily Graphic, marking the beginning of his career as one of the finest war correspondents of his generation. Picture Churchill in the Cuban jungle, dressed in the white uniform of a Spanish officer as he experiences his first taste of combat. The sound of Mauser bullets whistling overhead, the crack of rifle fire echoing through the tropical forest, and the sight of wounded men being carried to the rear all made profound impressions on the 20-year-old subaltern. He discovered that he possessed physical courage in abundance, and that the danger and excitement of battle appealed to his adventurous nature. But he also learned that war was not the romantic adventure depicted in the novels of his youth. The articles that Churchill wrote about the Cuban campaign revealed a natural talent for journalism that would serve him well throughout his career. His prose was vivid and engaging, combining careful observation with literary flair, and his analysis of military tactics and strategy showed a sophisticated understanding of warfare that impressed readers back in England. Most importantly, his dispatches revealed a political maturity that was remarkable in so young a man, as he analyzed the complex forces that were reshaping the Caribbean and predicted the eventual American intervention that would end Spanish rule in Cuba. Churchill's return to England in early 1896 was followed by his regiment's posting to India, the jewel of the British Empire, and the destination that every ambitious young officer hoped to reach. The India of the 1890s was a land of incredible diversity and complexity, where a few thousand British officials and soldiers ruled over hundreds of millions of Indians through a combination of military force, administrative skill, and careful manipulation of local rivalries. For Churchill, India represented the ultimate test of his abilities and the chance to participate in the great game of empire that had fascinated him since childhood. The voyage to India aboard a troop ship was a formative experience for Churchill, as he encountered for the first time the vast distances and exotic cultures that characterized the British Empire. The journey through the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, and the Red Sea to Bombay took several weeks, providing ample time for reading and reflection. Churchill used this time to educate himself about Indian history and politics, reading the works of Macaulay and other historians who had chronicled the rise of British power in the subcontinent. Picture Churchill's arrival in Bombay in October 1896, as he stepped off the troop ship into the overwhelming sensory experience of India. The intense heat and humidity, the cacophony of languages and dialects, the exotic smells of spices and incense, and the incredible diversity of peoples and cultures that made India unlike anywhere else on earth. For a young man who had never traveled beyond the familiar confines of Europe and the Caribbean, India was a revelation that expanded his understanding of the world and his place in it. Churchill's service with the 4th Hussars on the northwest frontier was the defining experience of his early military career, providing him with the combat experience and leadership opportunities that would shape his understanding of warfare and command. The frontier was one of the most dangerous and challenging postings in the British Army, where tribal warriors who had never been fully conquered by any empire continued to resist British rule through guerrilla warfare and sudden raids on isolated outposts. The Malakand Field Force expedition of 1897, in which Churchill served as both a cavalry officer and a war correspondent, was his first experience of serious combat and his introduction to the complexities of frontier warfare. The campaign was designed to punish Pathan tribes who had attacked British positions, but it quickly became a brutal conflict that tested the limits of British military power and revealed the difficulties of fighting an elusive enemy in mountainous terrain. Picture Churchill during the fighting around the Malakand Pass, leading his troop of cavalry in a charge against Pathan positions, while bullets whistled around him and the mountain peaks echoed with the sound of rifle fire. He was 22 years old, a young officer who had found his element in the chaos and danger of battle, demonstrating the physical courage and tactical skill that would later make him an effective war leader. His conduct during the campaign earned him the respect of his fellow officers and the admiration of the men under his command. The book that Churchill wrote about the Malakand campaign, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, established his reputation as both a military analyst and a literary talent. The work combined vivid descriptions of frontier fighting with sophisticated analysis of imperial policy and strategy, revealing a political and strategic understanding that was remarkable in so young an author. The book was widely praised by critics and became a bestseller, launching Churchill's career as a writer and establishing him as one of the most promising young men of his generation. Churchill's participation in the River War in Sudan in 1898 was the culmination of his early military career and his most significant experience of imperial warfare. The campaign to reconquer Sudan and avenge the death of General Gordon at Khartoum was one of the largest military operations of the late Victorian era, involving thousands of British and Egyptian troops equipped with the latest weapons and technology. For Churchill, who managed to secure a place in the expedition through his family connections and his growing reputation as a war correspondent, the Sudan campaign represented the chance to participate in a historic enterprise and to witness the climactic battle that would determine the fate of the Upper Nile. The Battle of Omdurman on September 2nd, 1898, was one of the last great cavalry charges in British military history and Churchill's most famous military exploit. As a member of the 21st Lancers, he participated in the regiment's charge against Dervish forces, an action that lasted only a few minutes, but provided enough material for a lifetime of storytelling. The charge was both magnificent and futile, a throwback to an earlier era of warfare that was already being superseded by modern weapons and tactics. Picture Churchill in the moments before the charge at Omdurman, sitting on his horse as the regiment formed up for the attack, the desert sun glinting off lance points and sword blades while the sound of drums and bugles filled the air. He was 23 years old, a young officer about to participate in one of the last great cavalry actions in military history, and he understood that he was witnessing the end of an era. The charge itself was a confused melee that lasted only minutes, but it provided Churchill with memories and material that would last a lifetime. The book that Churchill wrote about the Sudan campaign, The River War, was his masterpiece of military history and established him as one of the finest writers of his generation. The work combined detailed military analysis with philosophical reflection on the nature of empire and the clash of civilizations, revealing a depth of understanding that impressed even his critics. The book's criticism of the treatment of wounded dervishes and its questioning of some aspects of imperial policy showed a moral sensitivity that would characterize Churchill's approach to politics throughout his career. As you continue your peaceful journey towards sleep, imagine Churchill on the deck of a steamer carrying him down the Nile after the Battle of Omdurman, watching the ancient landscape of Egypt pass by as he reflects on the experiences that have shaped his understanding of war, empire, and leadership. He is 24 years old, a young man who has already seen more action and adventure than most people experience in a lifetime. But he is also beginning to understand that his true destiny lies not on the battlefield, but in the political arena, where the great questions of his age will be decided. Chapter 3: Political Awakening, 1900 to 1914. Churchill's return to England in 1899 marked the beginning of his transformation from soldier and war correspondent to politician and statesman, a transition that would define the rest of his life and establish him as one of the most significant political figures of the 20th century. The young man who had sought glory on the battlefields of empire was now ready to enter the arena where the real power to shape events resided, the House of Commons, that ancient institution where British democracy had evolved over centuries and where the future of the empire would be decided. The opportunity for Churchill to enter politics came through the Boer War in South Africa, a conflict that would test British military power and imperial resolve while providing the young Churchill with his most dramatic adventure and his entry into public life. The war began in October 1899 as a dispute between the British government and the Boer republics over political rights and mining concessions, but it quickly escalated into a major imperial conflict that would engage the attention of the entire world and establish South Africa as a crucial test of British determination and military capability. Picture Churchill aboard the steamship Du Nottar Castle as it carried him toward Cape Town in October 1899. Not as a soldier this time, but as a war correspondent for the Morning Post, one of London's most prestigious newspapers. He was 24 years old, already famous for his books about frontier warfare and his daring exploits in India and Sudan. But he was also a young man with political ambitions who understood that the Boer War would provide him with the platform he needed to launch his parliamentary career. The train journey from Cape Town to the front lines of the war took Churchill through some of the most spectacular scenery in Africa, past the wine farms of the Cape Colony and into the vast interior where British forces were struggling to subdue the Boer commandos, who had proven to be far more formidable opponents than anyone had expected. The landscape was unlike anything Churchill had seen before. Endless veld, stretching to distant mountains, isolated farmsteads scattered across the countryside, and the constant awareness that enemy forces might be lurking behind any kopje or in any donga. Churchill's capture by the Boers on November 15, 1899, during an armoured train reconnaissance mission near Estcourt, was the most dramatic episode of his early career and the event that would make him a household name throughout the British Empire. The ambush of the armoured train was a perfectly executed Boer operation that demonstrated the tactical skill and local knowledge that made the commandos such effective fighters. But it also provided Churchill with the opportunity to display the courage and leadership qualities that would define his character throughout his life. Picture the scene of the ambush as Churchill worked frantically to clear the damaged locomotive and get the wounded to safety, while Boer rifles cracked from the surrounding hills and bullets whistled overhead. He was unarmed, serving as a civilian correspondent, but his military training and natural leadership abilities took over as he organized the defense and evacuation of the train. His conduct during the action impressed both his British companions and his Boer captors, who recognized that they had captured someone of unusual ability and determination. Churchill's imprisonment in the State Model School in Pretoria was a frustrating experience for a young man accustomed to action and adventure. But it also provided him with valuable insights into Boer society and politics that would influence his later approach to South African affairs. The prison was a converted school building that housed several hundred British officers and civilians, and the enforced leisure gave Churchill time to read, write, and plan the escape that would make him famous throughout the English-speaking world. The escape itself, carried out on the night of December 12, 1899, was a masterpiece of planning and execution that demonstrated Churchill's resourcefulness and determination. Working with two other prisoners, Captain Aylmer Haldane and Sergeant Major Brocky, Churchill had planned a coordinated breakout that would take advantage of the guards' relaxed vigilance during the evening hours. When the moment came, however, only Churchill was able to get over the prison wall, leaving him alone in enemy territory with no knowledge of the local language and only a vague idea of how to reach the safety of British lines. Picture Churchill crouching in the garden of the State Model School as he waited for his companions to join him, the lights of Pretoria twinkling in the distance while he calculated his chances of reaching Portuguese East Africa and the safety of British territory. When it became clear that the others could not escape, he faced a crucial decision: return to the prison and wait for another opportunity, or strike out alone across hundreds of miles of enemy territory, with only his courage and resourcefulness to sustain him. The journey to freedom took Churchill across some of the most dangerous territory in South Africa, as he travelled by foot and by freight train through the heart of the Transvaal, while Boer authorities offered a substantial reward for his capture. His survival depended on a combination of luck, determination, and the assistance of British sympathizers, who risked their own safety to help him reach Portuguese territory. The adventure captured the imagination of the British public and established Churchill as a national hero whose exploits were followed eagerly by newspaper readers throughout the empire. Churchill's return to British lines was greeted with celebrations that reflected both relief at his safety and admiration for his courage and resourcefulness. The young war correspondent had become a celebrity whose escape from Boer captivity was seen as a symbol of British determination and ingenuity in the face of adversity. The publicity surrounding his adventure provided him with the platform he needed to launch his political career, and he was soon being courted by Conservative Party officials who recognized his potential as a candidate for Parliament. The general election of 1900, fought largely on the issue of the Boer War and imperial policy, provided Churchill with his first opportunity to seek election to the House of Commons. His candidacy for the constituency of Oldham was based primarily on his fame as a war correspondent and his dramatic escape from Boer captivity, but it also reflected his growing understanding of political issues and his ability to articulate a vision of Britain's role in the world that resonated with voters who were proud of their country's imperial achievements. Picture Churchill on the campaign trail in Oldham, addressing crowds of working-class voters who had come to hear the young war hero speak about his adventures in South Africa and his vision for Britain's future. He was 25 years old, tall and slightly stooped, with reddish hair and the pale complexion of someone who had spent years in tropical climates. But his voice carried the authority of someone who had seen action and proven himself under fire. His speeches combined personal anecdotes from his military service with broader themes about imperial responsibility and national greatness. Churchill's victory in the Oldham election was narrow but decisive, marking the beginning of a parliamentary career that would span more than 6 decades and establish him as one of the greatest parliamentarians in British history. His maiden speech in the House of Commons, delivered on February 18, 1901, dealt with the ongoing war in South Africa and demonstrated the oratorical skills that would make him one of the most effective speakers of his generation. The speech was well received by members on both sides of the House, who recognized that a new and significant voice had joined their ranks. The early years of Churchill's parliamentary career were marked by his gradual evolution from a conventional conservative backbencher to an independent-minded politician who was willing to challenge party orthodoxy when his conscience demanded it. His growing concern about social conditions in Britain, influenced by his reading of social reformers like Seabohm Rowntree, and his observations of poverty in his own constituency, led him to question the Conservative Party's commitment to addressing the needs of the working class. Churchill's decision to leave the Conservative Party and join the Liberals in 1904 was one of the most controversial moves of his early political career, earning him the lasting enmity of many conservatives who viewed his defection as an act of betrayal, motivated by personal ambition rather than principle. The immediate cause of his break with the Conservatives was their adoption of protectionist trade policies that Churchill believed would harm British consumers and damage the country's economic competitiveness. But the deeper reason was his growing conviction that the Liberal Party offered a better platform for the social reforms he believed were necessary. Picture Churchill crossing the floor of the House of Commons on May 31st, 1904, walking from the Conservative benches to take his seat among the Liberals while members on both sides watched in fascination and dismay. The physical act of changing sides was symbolic of a deeper transformation in Churchill's political philosophy. As he embraced the liberal commitment to free trade, social reform, and individual liberty that would guide his political development for the next 2 decades. Churchill's rapid rise within the Liberal Party reflected both his exceptional abilities and the party's recognition that they had acquired a politician of unusual talent and potential. His appointment as Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies in 1905 gave him his first taste of ministerial responsibility and the opportunity to influence imperial policy at a crucial moment in the empire's development. His work on South African reconstruction, Chinese labor issues, and other colonial matters demonstrated his capacity for administrative detail and his growing understanding of the complexities of imperial governance. The Liberal landslide victory in the 1906 general election brought Churchill into government as a junior minister in one of the most reformist administrations in British history. The new Liberal government, led by Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman and later by H.H. Asquith, was committed to a programme of social and political reform that would transform British society and establish the foundations of the modern welfare state. For Churchill, the victory represented the opportunity to participate in the great work of social reconstruction that he believed was necessary to maintain Britain's strength and unity in the face of growing international competition. As you drift deeper into peaceful slumber, imagine Churchill in his office at the Colonial Office during the summer of 1906, working late into the evening on the complex problems of imperial administration while the sounds of London traffic fade into the distance. He is 31 years old, a rising star in the Liberal Party who has already achieved more than most politicians accomplish in a lifetime. But he is also a man who understands that his greatest challenges and opportunities still lie ahead. The young soldier who sought glory on the frontiers of empire has become a statesman who will help guide Britain through the greatest crisis in its history. Chapter 4: Liberal Reformer, 1906 to 1914. The Liberal government that took power in 1906 represented a watershed moment in British political history, ushering in an era of social reform and progressive legislation that would fundamentally transform the relationship between the state and its citizens. Churchill, now 31 years old and serving as Under-Secretary of State for the colonies, found himself at the heart of this reformist movement, working alongside some of the most brilliant political minds of his generation to address the social problems that had been largely ignored by previous conservative administrations. Picture Churchill in the corridors of Whitehall during those early days of the Liberal government, moving between meetings with civil servants, colonial governors, and fellow ministers as he immersed himself in the complex details of imperial administration. The Colonial Office was one of the most important departments of government, responsible for governing territories that spanned the globe and contained hundreds of millions of people, and Churchill approached his responsibilities with characteristic energy and attention to detail. His work on South African reconstruction was perhaps his most significant achievement during this period, as he helped to design the constitutional arrangements that would eventually lead to the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. The challenge was to reconcile the competing interests of British settlers, Afrikaner farmers, and the African majority, while maintaining British strategic interests in the region. Churchill's approach was pragmatic and far-sighted, recognizing that lasting peace in South Africa would require generous treatment of the former Boer republics and the gradual development of self-governing institutions. The Chinese labor controversy, which involved the use of indentured Chinese workers in South African gold mines, provided Churchill with his first major political crisis and demonstrated his ability to handle complex moral and economic issues. The practice had been introduced by the previous Conservative government to address labour shortages in the mines, but it was widely criticised as a form of slavery that violated British principles of human dignity and fair treatment. Churchill's decision to phase out the system while protecting the interests of existing workers showed his capacity for finding practical solutions to difficult problems. Churchill's promotion to President of the Board of Trade in 1908 marked his entry into the front ranks of the Liberal government and gave him the opportunity to focus on the domestic social reforms that were becoming increasingly central to his political philosophy. The Board of Trade was responsible for commercial and industrial policy, labor relations, and economic regulation, making it one of the most important domestic departments and a crucial platform for anyone seeking to address the social problems of industrial Britain. Picture Churchill in his new office at the Board of Trade, surrounded by statistics and reports that documented the harsh realities of working-class life in Edwardian Britain. Unemployment, poverty, industrial accidents, and the constant insecurity that characterized the lives of millions of British workers. The young politician who had once sought adventure on the frontiers of empire was now confronting the social frontiers at home, where the battle for human dignity and economic justice was being fought in the factories, mines, and slums of industrial cities. The labour exchanges that Churchill established during his tenure at the Board of Trade were among the most innovative social reforms of the period, creating a national network of employment offices that helped unemployed workers find jobs while providing employers with access to available labour. The system was based on successful models from Germany and other European countries, but Churchill adapted it to British conditions and made it a cornerstone of the Liberal government's approach to unemployment. The exchanges were an immediate success, helping thousands of workers find employment while reducing the friction and inefficiency that had characterized the British labour market. Churchill's work on unemployment insurance, developed in partnership with David Lloyd George and other liberal reformers, represented a revolutionary approach to social security that would influence British policy for generations to come. The National Insurance Act of 1911, which provided unemployment benefits for workers in certain industries, was based on the principle that society had a collective responsibility to protect its members against the economic risks that were beyond individual control. For Churchill, the legislation represented the practical application of liberal principles to the social problems of the modern age. The constitutional crisis that dominated British politics from 1909 to 1911, triggered by the House of Lords' rejection of Lloyd George's People's Budget, provided Churchill with the opportunity to demonstrate his skills as a parliamentary debater and political strategist. The crisis centered on fundamental questions about the distribution of political power and the role of hereditary privilege in a democratic society, issues that went to the heart of liberal ideology and Churchill's own political beliefs. Picture Churchill during the great budget debates of 1909 to 1910, rising to speak in a House of Commons that was electric, with tension and political passion. The chamber was packed with members who understood that they were participating in a historic confrontation that would determine the future of British democracy while the galleries were filled with spectators who had come to witness the clash between the forces of tradition and reform. Churchill's speeches during this period were among his finest parliamentary performances, combining detailed knowledge of economic policy with soaring rhetoric about democracy and social justice. The Parliament Act of 1911, which limited the power of the House of Lords to veto legislation passed by the House of Commons, was a triumph for the Liberal government and a vindication of Churchill's belief in democratic reform. The legislation established the principle that the elected chamber should have ultimate authority over the hereditary chamber, while preserving the Lords' role as a revising and deliberative body. For Churchill, the victory represented proof that the British political system could adapt and evolve without revolutionary upheaval. Churchill's appointment as Home Secretary in 1910 brought him into one of the most challenging and controversial positions in British government, responsible for law and order, civil liberties, and the complex social tensions that were emerging in Edwardian society. The Home Office dealt with everything from prison reform and women's suffrage to industrial disputes and political extremism, requiring a combination of administrative skill, political judgment, and moral courage that tested even Churchill's considerable abilities. The suffragette campaign for women's voting rights presented Churchill with one of his most difficult political challenges, as he struggled to balance his personal sympathy for women's equality with his concerns about militant tactics and public order. The Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, had adopted increasingly violent methods to draw attention to their cause, including arson, bombing, and attacks on public figures. Churchill's response was characteristically nuanced, supporting women's suffrage in principle while opposing the militant tactics that he believed undermined the democratic process. Picture Churchill during the siege of Sydney Street in January 1911, personally directing police operations against a group of anarchist gunmen who had barricaded themselves in a house in London's East End. The incident, which lasted for several hours and ended with the death of the gunmen in a fire, became one of the most famous episodes of Churchill's tenure as Home Secretary and demonstrated his hands-on approach to crisis management. Critics accused him of grandstanding and unnecessary risk-taking, but supporters praised his courage and leadership under pressure. The industrial unrest that swept Britain in the years before World War I tested Churchill's commitment to social reform and his understanding of the relationship between capital and labour. The great strikes of 1910 to 1912, involving railway workers, miners, and dockers, reflected the growing militancy of organised labour and the increasing polarisation of British society along class lines. Churchill's response was to seek compromise and negotiation, while maintaining the government's responsibility to preserve public order and protect essential services. Churchill's growing interest in military affairs and national defence, which would become central to his later career, began to emerge during his final years as a Liberal minister. His concern about the growing naval rivalry with Germany and the deteriorating international situation led him to advocate for increased defence spending and military preparedness, positions that sometimes put him at odds with his more pacifist Liberal colleagues. His appointment as First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911 reflected both his expertise in military matters and the government's recognition that Britain needed strong leadership at the Admiralty during a period of increasing international tension. The naval arms race with Germany that dominated European politics in the years before World War I provided Churchill with his first opportunity to influence British defence policy at the highest level. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he was responsible for maintaining